everybody. It's great that you're coming to see us. We wish we were in St David's itself, but we're going to do this virtually. I'm in Cardiff and Paul is in South London. So we're going to chat, not about rugby, but as we have just been doing, but largely about obviously politics and about his most recently published book, which I have here, which is called Clear, Bright Future. And the subtitle of it is A Radical Defense of the Human Being. So we're going to have quite a chat, and then in due course, we'll open it up to members of the audience to ask questions. So I've read the book. I can thoroughly recommend it. It's a really good read, you know, and very suitable for a festival ideas, I would say. So I would recommend that as many as you possible buy a copy of Paul's book. So we'll kick off. So Paul, as I just said, the book is subtitled A Radical Defense of the Human Being. And in it, you argue that the damaging neoliberal agenda isn't just an economic policy opposed to equality, but it's taking over our very mindset and sense of being. As a student many years ago, I read Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, which was first published in 1964. It's a bit of a tough read, actually. It's not the easiest of works to get through, but and it's quite stodgy. But it put forwards the idea that people's entity, if you like, was being changed by advertising, and people were very susceptible to what advertising was going on in people's consciousness. But what you're arguing now, it goes way beyond that, really. Can you describe for us what you think is happening?
Yes, hello. And let me first of all say I'm so delighted to be virtually in St David's. I have a Pembrokeshire connection, and my godchildren live just a little bit further south of there, near Newgale, and I know it well, and I'll be there most of the summer. So when we finally get a real life St David's Festival, I'm there. I'm straight there. Yeah, let me just park Marcuse for a second and try and talk about what I mean by why we need a radical defense of the human being. I think we're in the middle of three crises. One is the economic model doesn't work for a lot of people. People can't see the future being any better than the present. As a result of that, we've seen people's belief in democracy begin to evaporate. Coming down the track at us is what I call a crisis of technological control. So the surveillance, the privacy problems, the problems of algorithms that control our behavior. And what, for me, all of this is rooted in is what I call in the book a crisis of the neoliberal self. Now, let me just unpack it. That word neoliberalism, often thrown around by the left, I still think it's a useful word. It describes not a set of ideas, but basically the world we've lived in since the 1989 at least. Free markets with elites trying to force free market logic down everybody's throats. A great recent example, a today example, is the British government's finally having an inquiry into children's social care, because it's all now dominated by private providers, some who are good, some not so good, but the prices have gone up. Now, the only way they can think of asking themselves the question, is this good or is it bad, is to ask, is it good for the market? So instead of a children's commissioner saying, is it good for children? We've got a competition commissioner saying, is it good for competition? Now, this to me speaks of a mindset that we got very used to over the last 40 years. We began to think of what John Stuart Mill called Homo economicus, economic man, as us. We started to take all decisions along the lines of, is it good for the market rather than human beings? Now, this was fine as long as the market worked. We treated the market like a machine that could take decisions for us. But then in 2008, the machine blew up and the system stopped working, and the inner logic of the ideology didn't make sense. You know, the market's supposed to correct itself. Instead, the state and the central banks bailed out the market. So where do we get to? by the middle of the last decade, by 2015, 2016, what we're seeing is a big crisis of who am I among many people. If the market's no longer guiding my life and it's not a machine that I can trust, what is? And for me, it's this crisis of the neoliberal self is at the root of all the things that are going wrong. We've seen huge adoption of conspiracy theories in the last couple of years. The rise of the far right, the storming of the US Capitol, is all part of a loss of belief in a kind of general passive ideology of, yeah, the market will sort it all out. And the beginnings of people looking for alternatives, some of which are worse than what we've just lived through. Now, you asked me about Marcuse, and I'm a big fan of Herbert Marcuse. As you say, he wrote the book One-Dimensional Man. One-dimensional man, it's man. I mean, we wouldn't use that term today. Marcuse was worried and pessimistic because he thought the classic proletariat, if you think about the Welsh mining working class as depicted in, for example, How Green Is My Valley, written, of course, by a Pembrokeshire writer. If you think about that, Marcuse is saying that's gone. It's been replaced by a world of consumption and advertising. And therefore, says Herbert Marcuse, we have to look outside the old working class for a new alternative to the proletariat, a mover of history. And so he began this search for, is it students? Is it anti-colonial struggles? Is it black people? In my book, I come to a more fundamental conclusion. It's everybody. It's everybody who doesn't like the world. I use this quote from Bertolt Brecht: the people who are going to change the world are people who don't like it. And I think that's the world we're in. And even though that old mining and engineering and factory proletariat is largely gone in the developed world, lots of people don't like the world the way it is. And what they're looking for, I would argue, is a new explanation of how it could be better and how we get there. And in the book, that's a little bit of what I'm trying to do.
Yes, Paul. I mean, another element to the book is actually throwing things forward, isn't it? Where you're talking about artificial intelligence, which is a topic which many people are preoccupied with, and I suppose it offers potential benefits, but it also offers some very negative possibilities for the future. And you go into this in some detail. What is it about artificial intelligence that you think we need to be aware of? And yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's lots of books out there about artificial intelligence, explaining it. We need to get our heads around it. It's got many, many phases to go through. Lots of books warning about the ethical and moral problems of it. I see all of those packaged into a wider problem, because for me, when we handed control of our lives to the market in a way that you see, if you compress the history, if you compress the last, somebody before, it's both Solver, isn't it, and St. Davies. We think about Solver as a harbour, the history of that as a modern, since the 17th century, the lime kilns, the arrival of ships, etc. We can say there's never been a time when people voluntarily handed control of everything in their lives to an external force. And yet, in the last 40 years, that's what we did. We said the market is a machine that knows everything. It can think better than me. If you'd said that to the Methodist preachers of Solver or St. Davies, or the Anglican, the Church of Wales in St. Davies, they'd have told you to get lost. No, that's been the religion, but the religion has failed. And so what my huge worry is that, of course, some people have gone heading down to fascism, to superstition, to alternative religions, but a lot of people are kind of going, well, there's a danger that a lot of people will say, well, bring on a better machine, bring on something that can actually take my decisions for me. And for me, that is where, if we don't go into this century of the arrival of AI, being prepared to demand a human-centric economy, human-centric politics, then the next thing that's going to happen, which is what's in all the AI textbook and has been all this in all the AI sci-fi since the year dot, is First of all, the AI will begin to give answers better than ours. That's what it's already doing. You can program it, albeit you have to program it to write an average Mozart symphony. It will do it. Some of them will be maybe at times better than Mozart's, more Mozart than Mozart. But that's only stage one. The next thing is it gives answers we can't understand. Once it gives answers we can't understand, human beings are going through a change as big as the arrival of the Neolithic, the arrival of agriculture. This is a new phase for our species. But the real scary bit is when it starts asking itself questions that we can't understand. That's coming. So everybody now has to think, hold on a minute, was it a good idea to create a generation of human beings who like being controlled? Because if they're going to be controlled by Trump or Viktor Orban in Hungary or Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, what's going to happen when they meet the AI? So that's where the AI comes into my thing. I'm not a science writer or a tech writer in that sense. I'm somebody who's trying to reformulate the ethical and political basis on which we confront this next phase of the technological revolution.
I mean, I guess it's in a sense as well, sort of on a very basic level, it's down to this whole idea which people have knocked around for many years about the fact that improvements in technology will lead to greater leisure and people will be able to pursue their cultural interests and all that sort of stuff. You refer to that in the book. But we know what the people who control the society are like. They're not wanting people to do that. They want to screw more work out of them all the time, don't they?
Well, Adam Smith pointed this out, excuse me, right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. He said, not one labor-saving device has ever shortened the working day. Of course, trade unions shorten the working day, not technology in that sense. But I'm a big believer in automation. I think I want a low work future. Now, this is something that a lot of my colleagues in the labor movement find very difficult because the clue is in the word labor. They find very difficult the idea of selling to voters or trade union members, the idea that we will work less. And they have this belief that our dignity and our self-image is created at work. Well, it has been for 250 years for the working class. But I see the possibilities in automation and in information technology. It will necessitate a move to a high culture, low work society. So, because what do we do when we're off work? We consume. Some of us consume 24-hour-a-day rugby, football, cricket channels. Others opera, but others surfing or fishing. But in the end, actually, Karl Marx talked about that, didn't he? In one of his earliest works, what's communism going to be like? Marx says, we'll hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, criticize literature in the evening. Only 2/3 of Marx's desired pastimes involve killing things. But you get the point. I see that as a viable future now for human beings. But the new version of who controls the machine is an absolute thing. Who controls whether the machine controls us is the issue.
Moving on, Paul, to look at what has happened on the political front internationally. There was one moment in your book which I thought was very interesting, which was where you spoke about how going back to 1981, which is of course before the recent crashes, etc., but there was quite a significant moment that took place after Mitterrand was elected as the president of France, wasn't there? Where, he basically had a coalition between socialists and communists, and he had a very radical program about changing France for the better and all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, and before too long, he had to ditch all of that because there was capital flight, and the capitalists were withdrawing their money, taking it abroad, and creating. I think there were 3 devaluations, weren't there, of the franc? Mm. So the danger is, isn't it, really, that when you're looking for left-wing alternatives, with this sort of internationalization of capital, which has come about over longer than the period that you've largely been focusing on, what can left-wing movements do in order to counter that kind of neoliberalism?
Well, the important thing about the Mitterrand experience, many people be alive today weren't born then. I mean, I sort of lived through it as a lefty activist, watching it happen. The importance in identifying it is to identify that moment and not the collapse of the Soviet Union, when a lot of people on the left said, oh, heck, what we want is impossible. Because the establishment version of it is socialism is unpopular or at sea or in a mess because Soviet Union collapsed, and they believed in that. I never believed the Soviet Union was anything other than a dictatorship, but I did see the possibility of a left-wing Labour government in this country, and I saw it. The big problem is you have to choose between, to a certain extent. Mitterrand said after the event, he said we had a choice to build the social France or to build Europe, because as the financial markets attacked France, what they did is they forced it off the currency peg that Mitterrand had committed to, and indeed before him Giscard d'Estaing had committed to, in order to begin the building of the Eurozone. Now, I think that tells you something, actually, that they could have chosen the other way. They could have said, right, okay, we're going to face down international capital. And in his own way, Mario Draghi in 2015 did that with the famous, we're going to do anything that it takes quote. It would take, because of the Eurozone in Europe, it would take the entire Eurozone to do that. But Britain, fortunately, we don't have that problem. I don't see international isolation and capital flight as a huge problem for a future left government in Britain, if we ever get one, because I think that since 2008, we've proved to ourselves that central banks and states can do quite a lot in defiance of financial markets. I think there's probably more to come. If you invest in Bitcoin, I mean, at the moment, it's through the roof. Central banks have warned there may come a day when you can't change it back into pounds, that they will legislate there'll be no exchange rate between Bitcoin and the sterling. And people go, well, can they do that? You bet they can do that. It'll be stuck in you can buy things from people who accept Bitcoin, but you maybe not ever change it back into your home currency. I think if they did that, there'd be a kind of weird explosion in people's heads. But actually, it just shows you the power that states and central banks have. And so for me, the imperative anyway, we're no longer talking about socialism in the way that probably Mitterrand or Tony Benn or Arthur Scargill once imagined it, because the overriding imperative for me is climate change, is getting the economy down to zero net carbon. There's no socialism on a burned planet, and therefore many of the programmatic political things that the left wants to do have to be reframed around zero net carbon. And if we all imagined, probably wrongly, that we could get there through some kind of process of fluffy, nice, alternative lifestyle. So many people in your neck of the woods, down in Pems, are into that, and good for them. But what the urgency now is to use the state to do big actions, big decommissioning actions on carbon. And it's going to feel like socialism, even from that point of view, to a lot of people who are not used to the idea.
I mean, I guess in terms of a sort of dirigiste approach, what have we been living through for the last year? I mean, with COVID, we've come to accept that a central government, obviously in Wales we've got a different government, but these governments have actually been telling us how to behave to the point of when we can leave our homes. So if we can take that, I mean, you could also have potentially a very strong radical government that was doing things. And I mean, do you think people would accept that?
Well, I don't read the crossover as quite so easy, because in a pandemic, the same as in a war or a natural disaster, the state becomes what Thomas Hobbes said it is. It's a contract between people to create a dictator over them to save them from anarchy. That's basically Hobbes 101, and we're in a Hobbesian world now. once that's over, I think there'll be a debate in people's minds. Well, did that, when some of it worked, okay, we got the Nightingale hospitals, the army designed and built them. We got the NHS rolled out the vaccine. Test and trace, 32 billion private project is a disaster. So there'll be an argument, I think, that the left can have there. But one argument I'd be very wary of is to promote the idea of a big centralized state, because people kind of, the arc of the universe bends towards a lot of things, actually, to paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr. But one of them, quite definitely, is towards individual freedom. People like being able to choose things. Our grandparents had no choice over most of the things in their lives. We do, and we like it. And so I wouldn't go too far down the route of saying this is a model for a future paternalistic state. What I would say is it's a model for action on climate. And for somebody like me who wants radical action on climate, what that means is decommissioning as fast as possible the fossil fuel and commissioning as fast as possible alternative forms of energy, one of which is sitting on your doorstep, as you know, in Swansea Bay. For all the green credentials of the Tory government, for all the fact that, that they're going to hold COP26, let's remember what a green government would do is it would get on a helicopter, fly to Swansea and lay a brick where the first wall is going to be built tomorrow. Until we start seeing governments doing that, I'm in favour of more centrality there.
So, Paul, I wanted to take you now to what I found another very striking part of the book, which is where you're describing the sort of individual that has grown up within this neoliberal international society that we have over recent decades. You talk about a new variety of social archetype who you place in Brazil, but who exist in many places. A ruthless, self-centered person focused not on the collective struggle or community action, but on a personal struggle for survival. So how widespread do you see this phenomenon being? And are such people beyond redemption? And does their existence make it very difficult for...
I'm not making a moral judgment about them, because I'm probably one myself. What I'm trying to say is that there's an old saying in Marxism, social being determines social consciousness. What we are determines the way we think. Now, the point is that this was imposed on us. This kind of gangster way of thinking. I use Brazil because it's a really obvious thing that the Brazilian slums, the favelas, were created originally inside empty factories. That's where people started from. And there was a huge community consciousness, as there is, for example, in many mining villages and indeed rural communities and mining communities in Wales. But what happened in Brazil is that they actually went in, the gangsters went in and shot everybody they could find who represented that community consciousness, took over the community infrastructure and ran it as a criminal enterprise. And to survive in it, what did you have to do? You had to look out for number one. The word to struggle in Spanish now, in many Latin American countries and Portuguese, means luchar, means to be an individual who can fight for their family. Whereas for my generation and possibly yours and some of the older people watching, struggle meant everybody together. Now, somebody did that to us. I could see it happening. My dad just said, if that's work, if that's living, I'm not interested. If that's what you need to survive, well, I'm not interested. Others adapted, and young people, my Welsh godchildren, they've grown up not knowing anything other than this imperative to be selfish. Being selfish makes the world go around. That's Milton Friedman and Frederick Hayek 101. That by pursuing your own interests, that's the best way to make the market work. Now, my thesis, controversial though it sounds, is that if in the space of one lifetime, mine, I was born in 1960, you can see human beings turn from generally collective, solidaristic, caring, community-based people to individual, selfish, backstabbing, acquisitive people, then we could do it backwards, or rather to something else, but going forwards. It's not inevitable that the kind of individuals who've been created by this marketized society have to remain atomized. That, going back to Marcuse, is my difference with him. He thought it was irreversible. That's why he was a pessimist by the end. I'm utterly optimistic, because I think the society we've grown up in, adding information technology to all the mix of Thatcherism, has actually produced a way out. It's produced a way in which highly individualized people can connect to each other and take collective action.
So, I mean, just looking at Brazil for a moment, there was a very interesting judgment, wasn't there, from the Supreme Court a couple of days ago, which quashed the convictions of Lula. So there could be a really epic presidential battle, couldn't there, coming up between him and Bolsonaro?
Yeah, and this is what I'm writing about in the book that is coming out later this year, How to Stop Fascism. History, Ideology, Resistance is its subtitle. And there's a whole bit in it about Bolsonaro, and not just Bolsonaro, but the way that Bolsonaro has fostered and used fascist movements and the rest of it. Because Bolsonaro has basically ridden on the back of a mass reactionary consciousness that's been created by and large by big business and YouTube, spreading anti-vax ideologies, anti-science ideologies. So Bolsonaro himself, I don't think, could be classed as any kind of fascist. There are fascists who support him. They try to storm their own Supreme Court, rather in a kind of practice run for what happened with Trump. Bolsonaro's egging them on. The violence and the mass mobilization around Bolsonaro, who, by the way, has managed to kill something like 174,000 of his own people with COVID. He's another Trump, he's another Boris Johnson in this sense. It's weird how the free market authoritarians are always the ones with the high death tolls. What that judgment, which everybody, I think, sensible knew would come, what it means is, from now until the next election, everything in Brazil is about persuading the Brazilian public that the cost of electing Lula will be so high in terms of the loss of democracy that it's not worth it. What I mean is that from now till then, they will put people on the streets and say, if you elect this guy again, we could have a military coup. Because the president, Bolsonaro, talks about military coups every 5 minutes. And like Anton Chekhov, I believe, if a gun appears in Act 1 of a play, then by Act 3, somebody's going to be shot dead. And if a talk of a military coup appears in Bolsonaro's media every day, then it's telling people, don't vote for this Lula guy, because you'll lose your democracy as the price. So it's with Trump gone, this problem is not over. In fact, my book that I've written is very premised on the idea that it's just starting.
Of course, we only have to go back 10 years to another momentous piece of history, which was the Arab Spring. And there was a lot of hope invested at the time. People were interested in, watching what was going on in all these various squares. And you write very vividly about that, actually, Paul. What went wrong with the Arab Spring, and why was it that after this period of hope, what happened was in these countries, they sort of reverted to the authoritarianism which they had for so long?
Yeah, I think you've reminded me, it's about 10 years ago that I turned up in Egypt to try and cover it. Although it has to be said, Newsnight wouldn't send me to cover it. I took holiday. So I arrived on my holiday and just got stuck into it. Okay, I mean, the Arab Spring was part of a wider thing, which included the Occupy movement and the student movement here, and the occupation of the squares in Spain and Italy and Greece. And in other words, it was part of a wider new type of struggle, which is where the networked people, that we call them in sociology, networked individuals, found their collective voice in a different way through non-hierarchical, horizontal forms of action that could survive actually some of the ordinary repression. But in Egypt, it's fairly specific. They toppled the dictator Mubarak, it's a mass movement. I went into the slums, both the Muslim and the Christian slums, because there are both in Cairo, and people described how across the sectarian divide they'd come together and, you know, they'd held hands, Christian, Muslim, one hand. Okay, that's what happened. What happened on the square, of course, was a lot of urban intelligentsia, folk singers, students, and that was beautiful in its own way. But the really beautiful thing for me is slum dwellers clasping hands across a very strong religious divide. What happens then? I talked to them. The left, after 20 years of total repression, there was no left organizations. They were weak. Many of the ones who'd been underground under Mubarak had also been tortured. So they were people who were effectively trying to advise. But, you know, if you've gone through trauma like that, you're not going to be 100% yourself. It takes a great, strong person to be that in the crisis. So the young people said, okay, well, we need a party. Let's form one. Then someone else said, no, I think I've got a better idea. So by 3 months after the fall of Mubarak, there's an election happening, and there's about 4 left and liberal parties fighting each other. And anyway, none of them had given thought to, okay, Cairo is an amazing urban metropolis with, I think it's 11 million in the day and 11 million at night and 16 million during the day. People come from so far. Even there, the power of radical Islam, you know, among effectively migrant workers, very poor people, people with no access to literacy, was strong. And that had been suppressed by Mubarak because that was the purpose. The idea was strong Arab secular dictatorships represses Islam. That's the deal. You could see the other side of it. The people who had, you know, it's what largely accepted that the Muslim Brotherhood stood back from the revolution, that they were not trusted. They didn't trust the revolution itself because they couldn't control it. When I first went into the Muslim Brotherhood's HQ in Cairo, when they were still just after the revolution, they were getting ready for the election. It was a building about the size of, in St. David's terms, you know, sort of, what is the Farmer's Arms? You know, I mean, it's not big. Inside it, but what I noticed inside it, there was a servant polishing rubber plants with pledge. In other words, it was all kind of, you know, it was the lower middle class, engineers, doctors, and they were already fighting. For example, in the Doctors' Union, I saw literally a fist fight in the Doctors' Union building between the Muslim Brotherhood and the left, who both wanted to become the leadership of the Doctors' Union. Now, in the end, you can't accuse the left of not fighting because they were literally fist fighting over doctors, in this case, over who controls the revolution. When it came to an election, it was a no contest because the election is tens of millions of pounds, tens of millions of peasants in Upper Egypt who live in villages, as they've done for thousands of years, listening to the radio. And better than the radio is a guy who gets you up in the morning with a prayer and tells you how to vote. So the secular left were nowhere. Now, what then happened? And it's really interesting, and it's tragic, really, because the middle class looked at the Muslim Brotherhood and they said, okay, we can see where this is going, because the Muslim Brotherhood wasn't in this way sympathetic to Al-Qaeda or anything like that. They were beginning to encroach on the hard-fought social rights of the urban middle class of Cairo and other cities. And this urban middle class, they can look at one of the slums of Cairo and say, yeah, well, it's an Islamic slum, you know, or that's a Coptic Christian one. But here in central Cairo, at the folk club, at the jazz club, you know, there's a buzzing nightclub scene in Cairo. You touch that and you're in trouble. And this is what the Muslim Brotherhood started. So they said, because they looked at their own social power and it was minimal, inevitably, I think, especially the way it was done, because it was very cleverly done, I think, and I'm certain there was external interference, they created what looked like a radical secular get rid of the Muslim Brotherhood government movement, and behind it stood a really vicious army dictatorship. So what I've just described are facts that I experience. What lies behind them is political immaturity. And so I think that you've got to say, well, could you say don't overthrow Mubarak? No, he was going to fall. Could you say form a party faster and have tactics aimed at those villages that say we respect your religion, we're not trying to suppress it, but these Muslim brotherhoods, they're just a bunch of, in British terms, Tory engineers and doctors. That's all they are, with a bit more radicalism in their religion. I think that could have happened, and certainly not to have been duped by the way the army took power. And I think so. What happened is revolutions go through cycles. In a way, the cycle of 2011 to me now looks a lot like the 1905 revolution in Russia. It was a practice run for the thing that might happen a little bit more massively worldwide, because people have social power. And you see, look, even today we're involved. There's a court case right now, I think it might be over, to try and say women want to come to London, Clapham Common, to protest against the murder of this poor woman who's been murdered. And they wanted to have a vigil. And the police said no. Do you know what? If they wanted to, those women will have that vigil, whether the police say yes or no. People have social power. And there's a huge pent-up desire for change, I think. And let's see what happens when everybody's been vaccinated and when there's no excuse for not doing politics. I think we'll probably see a thaw of this social peace that we've been living through. So yeah, I think the short summary is 2011 was the first proof that the individualized person, fragmented by neoliberalism and technology, can fight back. But there will be other waves of resistance.
Another very interesting idea, Paul, that you've got in the book, which is something which preoccupies a lot of people who get involved in social media. A lot of trolling is going on. You've got a lot of bots. You've got a lot of conspiracy theories that are manifesting themselves. And what you're saying in there is that this is already part of some idea which they've got, which is based on disruption, and it's really geared towards disrupting discourse. And it doesn't really matter, I suppose, exactly what they're saying, but what they want to do is to create a disruption to civilized discourse so that people become disillusioned with the whole nature of things, and they don't know who to trust anymore. I've seen a lot of this on social media. Now, to whose advantage is this, and what is the end game?
Well, people in power. It's people in power who, that's whose advantage it is whose advantage it is. But let's think about where this comes from. I experienced the great upsurge of social media as a liberation. As a journalist, suddenly I was delighted to be able to interact directly with the sources of stories, to publish directly on blogs with editors running way behind saying, "What have you just done, Paul?" I published a BBC blog. I used to be able to hit publish on my blog, the BBC. Not anymore, obviously, but using Twitter to put my own stories out. And I remember my editor saying to me, I'm supposed to read your tweets before you do them. I said, well, how are you going to do that? Because I'm going to be in Morocco doing it. And they said, well, we have to make a bargain that you take responsibility. I said, right, I'll take responsibility. That's what this technology is about. It's cut you out of the frame, mate. So I experienced it as a liberation, and I wondered. This was in my book, 2011 book, Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere. I said the big open question is, can the elite use this technology against us? I think we can now see that the answer is yes. But it took them, and in the clear bright future, I've tried to write a little mini history of how they did it. It took them several goes. Their first instinct was to shut the internet down. So that's what Recep Tayyip Erdogan did in Turkey, shut the internet down. Mubarak shut Facebook down. But they realize that you can't run a society like that. So the next thing is propaganda. And they realize that propaganda doesn't work because people don't believe it. So what else? You could the next tactic was creating a bubble. So the idea is you've got, like, when I was in Gaza covering the Gaza war, I used to look at network diagrams of where am I in the consumption of Israeli and Palestinian Twitter. And there's a bubble here of Palestinian Twitter, and I'm right in the middle of it. There's Israeli Twitter, and nobody's reading my stuff. That is a physical bubble. Bubble creation is a huge weapon for people like Trump. I think the left use it as well. You know, they create their own bubble in which, if you're not in the language, you can't really be in it. That's, I think, bad for civil society. But bubbles were created, they existed. The problem is they don't win you elections. Your own bubble is often not big enough to win. And it loses its persuasive power with the center, which, as we know in politics, everybody's obsessed with the center. So finally, around about 2015, they hit on and it should have been obvious if you know anything about information theory, which arose in the 1950s about over how to run technically a telephone network without overwhelming the signal, as it's called, which is the bit you want, the words, with noise. So we have this dichotomy, signal and noise. Information Theory 101 says the best way to destroy an information network is to flood it with noise. And that is what trolling, disinformation, harassment, doxing, all the bots, all the anons, that's what it is. It's noise. It's there to make you go, I can't stand it anymore. I'm taking my headphones off. Now, once you understand that, you can think beyond the individual piece of noise. I tend to look at if someone harasses me or threatens me or tells lies about me or puts disinformation into my stories. I just tend to see it, all right, I can see the individual problem. What this is noise trying to stop the signal getting across. So you have to then find strategies to make the signal cut through the noise. And I don't think we, the media, are very good at it. And individual people find it very difficult because they get consumed. You know, if somebody says, we know you did this in 1963, you want to go, no, I must put this right. So the next minute you spend the next half of your day digging out what you did in 1963 and telling them, and you, by the end of it, you realize what they've just stopped you communicating. So there are things we can do. I think it involves regulating. It involves regulating the media companies to make them responsible for the content. If you did that, you see, Twitter is the biggest purveyor of anti-Semitic hate in the world, but it won't admit that. It says, no, you, Joe Blog, Joe Bot, Paul 34967, he's the one, it's his problem. That account may not even be a person. So we have to make people accountable for the things they say, because there are laws, and they're not brilliant laws, they could be better, both more lax and more stringent. There are laws that me and you both follow and we write things. So anonymity might be a thing we have to look at. I don't want to cut out anybody's right to be anonymous online. So if you want to say, look, I work for a terrible employer and I want to tweet it however it is, I'm not going to make you reveal who you are, and I'm not going to allow the employer to sue the intermediary to find out who you are. But I'm going to ask Twitter to accept that people who use Twitter have to be real. Because you can't vote, an anonymous fictitious person can't vote. So why can they influence the right to vote is the question I would ask.
Yeah. Now, you talk about devising a resistance strategy.
Yeah.
And you talk about trying to get a new economic model which will challenge and take over from neoliberalism. So you say at one point in the book, Paul, we might need to take public services that are failing and ripping off their customers into public ownership, to raise wages by outlawing precarious work and empowering trade unions, to tax, borrow and spend in order to create new, vibrant, human-centered public services, public space and a modern infrastructure. So how do you see that being achievable? And in Britain, would you see the current Labour Party under its current leadership offering such a programme at a general election?
Well, okay, so let's be clear about one thing, and it's something that the left, traditional left, find quite hard to accept. If we've only got till 2030, 2035 to decarbonize the world, I think it's 99% certain that when the world is decarbonized, it'll still be capitalist. Not the same kind of capitalism, but we're not going to achieve a non-capitalist world in 10 or 15 years. What we can do is achieve a kind of capitalism that is susceptible to be abolished. So for me, that's not primarily about state ownership. It's about suppressing market forces. We also have to give people skin in the game of the future. And like, leave aside Labour, but just if I say to you and your audience that almost the most radical thing that you can say in Britain at the moment is not, oh, there should be less inequality. Everyone will go, yeah, there should be less inequality. There should be more opportunity. Yeah, so let's open up Oxbridge to state schools. Fantastic. But if you try saying wages should be higher and profits lower, that's it, cardiac arrest. It's no, the thing is, the wage share of GDP has shrunk by about 7% during this period of free market economics, and the profit share has grown by about the same. And it's true in most developed countries. We call it in economics the wage share and the profit share. All I want to do, apart from climate change and addressing zero net carbon, is in a single sentence, what would sort most of it out is suppressing the profit share and boosting the wage share. As somebody who wants a post-work future and all the rest of it, I can see the limitations of that. But I know how radical it is, because every time I say it, that's the moment these kind of BBC presenters, they go white, because they can't imagine what that might be like. What it would be like is would be that most people would have a very decent job they could live on, and most investors would be able to put their money into risky stuff that made innovations rather than luxury. I live in London, luxury flats that are empty. It's where most of the money is, footballers' money, all around me. See, look at my window. Luxury flats with no lights on for year in, year out. That's where the money of the rich is. So we could disincentivize that. Now, you asked me about Labour. I think, first of all, I think that, let's be honest, I'm a Labour Party member and I supported Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader. I'm a supporter of Starmer for reasons I'll come to. The thing is about Labour that we might have to say that the brand itself in the wider United Kingdom, in Wales, it's got its allure, you know, because I think it's very successfully mapped itself on to not nationalism, but a collective national spirit that is fairly comfortable with the concept of Labourism. It hasn't in England. England's a very culturally divided country. In fact, you'll know that quite a lot of English people who live in Wales are quite culturally, you know, sort of antipathetic to the way Wales is. Now, Labour's problem is, how do you construct an electoral alliance to however many seats it is, 164 seats to win a majority? I can't see that happening without you construct an alliance with other parties. If COVID hadn't come along, I think if Labour had had 5 years of untrammeled political antagonism to make its point, then it might be. But COVID will hang around until the middle of this parliament, and Boris Johnson could call a snap election. So I think it's likely that progressive people, what do I mean by that? People who want zero net carbon, anti-sexism, anti-racism, a global orientation, peace in the world, a non-repressive government, and above all, one that isn't a bunch of corrupt liars, we're going to have to make alliances with each other. Now, those alliances, the first time I go into the room of that alliance is, what will you give up? Isn't it? It's not, what can we add? People aren't going to be saying, we love zero net carbon. Can we do something else as well for the biosphere? They're going to be saying, what can we take away? That's the realpolitik world we live in. And I think that it's not, at the moment, what I want to do is equip Labour with the tactical and strategic capability to deal with that situation, rather than lumber it with a bunch of policies that it will only have to give away the moment it enters coalition negotiations. That's the honest world answer to the world we live in. I know that Wales is different, in the sense that, although we should say that we're doing this virtual Ideas Festival in a Tory seat, aren't we? That I think that in a way, the future of politics is beyond where all the parties are at the moment. And it's why vision and future orientated thinking, and quite the other thing is honesty, the ability to say, what is real, rather than to wrap every phrase in some kind of cotton wool ball of meaninglessness, is what I try and do. And I can tell you that there are very few politicians who really are up for that. One of them is Clive Lewis, the Norwich MP, who I'm very sympathetic to politically and personally. And I think he's a good avatar for the kind of politics that we might have to do if we want to get rid of this Tory government.
Now, St. David's, the eponymous St. David, one of his most famous sayings was supposed to be, was do the little things. Yeah. Now, towards the end of your book, Paul, you reach a point where you're talking about what individuals can do. And you describe what you call little acts of rebellion. And you say, for example, that when you go to shop in a supermarket, one little act of rebellion can be to go to the staffed till as opposed to the self-service till, to say, I want to be served and assisted, and I want to pay a human being. Now, when I was reading that, I thought, yeah, I can go along with that. And in fact, I tend to do that myself, because I'm often buying a bottle of wine or a couple of bottles of beer or something, and you've got to have all this hassle, haven't you, of somebody coming to say he looks under 25 or over 25. So I do it anyway. But I take your point. But that's a very minimalist sort of approach to things, isn't it, Paul?
Yeah, on its own, it won't change the world. Although I would say that a non-moralistic point I'd just make here is that we, the customer, are supposed to be right. If we create demand, Tesco are supposed to supply it. That's their point. If there is demand to be personally served by a human being, it should be responded to. But the wider point is, what I'm trying to say in this book, and I have no embarrassment as an atheist whatsoever talking about both St. David, about St. Augustine, who's the great Aristotelian philosopher in Christianity, St. Augustine of Hippo, and then Thomas Aquinas, who all, for me, I don't know as much about David and that kind of early Christian Celtic Christianity, although I can see its relation. What it is, Christianity for me, there's a whole passage in this book that describes Christianity as a social revolution, and in a way, not simply as a social revolution, but also an economic revolution. It was a refusal to be ruled by a failing slave system. And it was a refusal to be ruled in a way that stratified human beings into human beings and non-human beings. That is the revolutionary core of Christianity, as of course it is in Islam, in a slave society. Now, I want, as a leftist, as a Marxist, and I am a Marxist, but I want Marxism to take on board a huge failing that I think it was built into it, not by Lenin or Stalin, but by Marx. And that is, it boycotted moral philosophy. If you read Das Kapital, there is an implicit moral philosophy in Das Kapital, and that is exploitation is bad, child labor is bad, alienation is bad. There's good and evil. There really is a good and evil system there. But they always try to say, well, we're not moral philosophers. I preferred the honesty of the working class themselves. Working class had a moral philosophy, but we called it class consciousness. And it was about it asks exactly the question that Aristotle and St. Augustine ask. And it is, what is a good society and what does a good person look like in that society? Now, funnily enough, that's not the way moral philosophy is currently posed inside modern capitalism. Moral philosophy for, say, liberalism says, how do we hurt the least number of people? This to me is at its best the liberal philosopher John Rawls. It's how do we structure capitalism in a way that we get the most equality and the least inequality? Or it's just the amoralism of the kind of Nietzschean, stab you in the back and run away laughing, amoralism of Silicon Valley and the hedge fund guys. So I think there is a powerful argument to be made anyway, from our experience, that we're going to need a moral philosophical approach to things like climate, things like exploitation. That it's not just functional. It would be a good idea if there wasn't an exploitation. But if you add the challenge of artificial intelligence, the need for a return to moral philosophical thinking by the left, for me, becomes absolute. Because if you're going to a century where you know that some rich person with a big computer is going to say, and the computer itself will say, on what basis do you, Paul Mason, claim the right to order me, the computer, to switch on and off, let alone resist my instructions? You, the mere human being, are less clever than me, and most human beings are. That's the point of me, the AI. I want to be able to switch the computer off, and to do that, I need to have a theory of human beings, who they are and what they can do. Because my theory of human beings, and this is the early Karl Marx, is that they can set themselves free. They're the only living organism on this planet that we know that has a social history, starting at the Neolithic, going through to last week's rugby match or whatever. We have a social history. We change our own nature, and we don't just have a natural history. That gives me the confidence to have what we call a teleological view. I believe human beings have a telos, a purpose to set ourselves free. There's a good chance we'll do it. Now, on that basis, I don't think the computer has that telos. I don't, because it's not a living organism. No matter how clever it is, it hasn't evolved to do that. We can switch it off. So on that basis, I can have an argument with the computer. I want to warn people, you will not win any arguments with an artificial intelligence that is not based on humanism. And what's the problem? In the last 40 years, as we adopted neoliberal economic doctrines, we adopted, many of us, postmodernist views of human beings. That is, the idea that the human being is just a constructed machine, constructed out of its circumstances, and that humanity itself is a social construct, as is, said some of the postmodernists, science. This is why, I've made myself unpopular with a lot of left people. I'm also unpopular with the postmodernists, because I just want to go to war with that view of human beings. It's not true. I think we could refute it, but if it were true, we'd be doomed to a life of control by intelligent machines, and I don't believe that is the future of our species. So I want to put humanism at the heart of everything again. And if you think that sounds like it's motherhood and apple pie, try saying it to a 24-year-old person who's been doing a PhD in postmodernism, and it sounds crazy to them. It means their PhD is wrong, which is why I love this, because we either win this argument or we don't win it, but we have to have the argument.
Okay, so you wrote the book when Trump was the president, and he's a sort of looming malevolent figure who's hovering over the pages as you read it to a degree. Got defeated last November, out of office in January. Biden takes over. Has that changed things for the better?
Well, it certainly changed things for the better, but it hasn't removed the threat of what Trump represents. 10 million more people voted for Trump this time than last time, knowing everything about him. Not a single Republican lawmaker in the Senate or the House of Representatives voted for Biden's legislation. 147 members of the House of Representatives voted to overturn the result in 4 states. 14 state governors tried to overturn the result. It is a Texas law case, it's called. This party, Republican Party, has become an incubator for far-right fascism. I mean, I'm afraid that's what it is. If fascists turn up dressed as fascists and attack the Congress dressed in military garb, and you apologize for them, whether you're a fascist or not doesn't matter. It means that you become the facilitator. And for Abraham Lincoln's party and the party of Dwight Eisenhower to be in that situation tells us how dangerous the world now is. We've got parties that can be taken over by shadow parties. I would argue the Conservative Party has in part also been taken over by Vote Leave and by parts of the old UKIP. Its membership in lots of parts of the world is no longer what it was. Certainly its entire parliamentary cohort, there's not a single convincing liberal conservative, from my point of view, in Parliament. Whereas Cameron and Osborne 10 years ago were liberal conservatives, led by, that was the whole point of the A-list, to diversify. So no, I think that Trump is gone, but the danger remains. And indeed, it's like in the class struggle, we're in a class struggle. Once you create the precedent for something, it never goes away. One of my earlier books, I wrote about the famous uprising in the French city of Lyon in 1834, where the workers took the city, the silk workers. And afterwards, when they took back control, the elite, somebody said to this elite journalist, "Why aren't you celebrating?" He said, "Because the silk workers are called canoes." He said, "Because from now until the end of history, until the end of time, each silk worker will tell the silk worker's son, once we took over the city and kicked out the bourgeoisie." Now, I think in the same way, every fascist will tell themselves, once we took the capital, and the next time we do it, we go with millions, not thousands. That's the dream. In my current book that I'm working on, I'm doing the proofs in front of me right now, we talk about Georges Sorrell, the anarchist philosopher who became a right-winger in France. He had this view of myth. It's very important to my work to understand at the moment what myth is. Myths in politics are not weird stories that explain the world like they are in religion. The political myth, the Sorrellian myth, is a story that by believing it and acting upon it makes itself come true. And that's where the American far right is. They're in the world of myth making about how they get to power through a civil war. And again, I mentioned Chekhov. If somebody mentions civil war in Act 1, then in Act 3, there's going to be a civil war. And I hope there isn't in America, but you can see the elements of it there. Biden has made a good start. Let's remember why. Because the American equivalent of the Corbynistas, Bernie Sanders, having been defeated, didn't sit there going, "We hate you, we're sulking." They made deal after deal with Biden, and they mobilized their people to get Biden into power. That's why he's in power. In Georgia, in Arizona, that was the work of the left. Now, that's where I think we should be doing. Even if you don't agree with Starmer's politics, I don't agree with all of them. I think he was the best man for the job, the most likely person to hold Labour together. The point about being left now is get behind trying to oppose the Tories and get behind the possibility of a different kind of government. Because time is marching on towards the zero net carbon imperative, which I hope everybody sitting in, virtual St. David's, and remembering what happens to Newgale Beach every 3 or 4 years, gets over swamped by the sea, the roads washed away, the council has a debate. Are we ever going, should we just leave it? That's climate change. You can't ignore it. You've got to center it in politics. And so to me, there's a clear division between Labour, Plaid, the SNP, the Greens on the one hand, and the Tories on the other. I think the planet's got a chance, or Britain's got a chance of doing what it needs to do for the planet under a progressive Labour-led coalition. There's no chance under Johnson. So that alone should be enough to make people sort of be realistic about what we do in politics.
So this is really the last question from me, and then we'll open it up a bit.
There are already some really good questions in the sidebar, which I'm looking at. So
yeah,
sidebar people, I'm not ignoring you.
No, we're going to move on to those. But just finally for me, what significance do you attribute to the level of support for independence in Scotland, albeit be it sort of slightly diminished by the sturgeon salmon row over the last couple of weeks, and to a lesser extent in Wales?
Well, I covered the 2014 referendum, and I interviewed 16-year-olds who were allowed to vote, And what really made me think that Scotland was going to go independent in this century was that they were overwhelmingly, those 16-year-olds, pro-independence. Even, see, nobody wants to talk about this, but journalists should talk about difficult things. One guy said to me, I'm voting independence and I don't even support the right football team. What he meant was that he was a Glaswegian Protestant and that the old community around him were very unionist, indeed loyalist, some of them. But he wasn't. So you got a unionist Protestant Rangers supporters voting for independence. I thought when their kids, those 16-year-old kids will one day have 16-year-old kids. It's no 6 years on. So we're not, it's within 10 years, some of them will have kids. And one day they'll have 16-year-old kids. At that point, Scotland's going independent. And there's no way you're going to stop it. Unless, what? Unless the left takes power and stays in power for decades and enacts social justice and enacts anti-racism and enacts a constitutional change settlement that makes the current levels of devolution, both in Scotland and Wales, look minimal. If we do that, then there's a chance that Scottish people might say, well, it's not worth the trouble because we've already got more or less everything we wanted. Coming to Wales, it's really interesting. I've seen there's been this uptake. It's interesting. Again, there's a demographic thing. With every generation in which Welsh becomes more embedded in society, if you remember that episode of The Crown where Charles turns up at Aberystwyth, and I can't remember, he doesn't know who Owen ap Gruffydd is, and he doesn't really speak Welsh, and he's rubbish. That was in our lifetime. I remember that really clearly, the investiture, and now it would be unthinkable for that to happen. So the language, I think, is a thing. I think Welsh Labour in power, almost in permanent power in Cardiff Bay, is a controversial thing. I can see in the valleys, you've got these anti-Labour mass independent kind of politics movements, Merthyr Council Truths, 17,000 people in a Facebook group ranting away against Labour. I can see that. But to be honest, Mark Drakeford has done a decent job. And I think people could see that he did a different job to Boris Johnson, that he did it in a humane way. And why is that? Because Mark, last time I met Mark, he was sitting in his office with a little gas fire on a main street in, I can't remember which bit of Cardiff it is. And it was the end of the day. And they were wanting to be interviewed by me. And a woman knocks on the door and says, I've been refused benefit. And she's a young mum. And without wanting to patronize her, she didn't look like she had a clue about anything. And she had certainly had no clue that she was talking to the Deputy First Minister at the time. She had no clue who he was. So he says, come in. And he sits her down and he said, right, come here. Let's get on the phone. And my interview was then off for about an hour. That's, I think people can see that at its best, that is what Welsh Labour is. Now, the question is, Gordon Brown's working on this thing for Starmer of a constitutional convention, a big change project. I think that's overdue. I think even if people are happy with the levels of devolution, often the times they'll say, well, in the valleys, you have these conversations. Why do you vote Brexit? Because European Union is another layer of government. All they did, they built roads and people left on those roads and the jobs went with them. Okay, well, no, lads, the European Union's gone. We're out of it. So that's one layer of government you don't have to worry about. Okay, but now it's like, should the Welsh government exist or not? I think the Welsh government should have more powers. Now, I support the right of nations to self-determination. If the time comes when Wales as a whole wants to secede from Britain, United Kingdom, the rest of the UK, then it has the right to do so. The problem is the slight problem of how do you get from Llandudno to St David's. I once did that drive. It was a beautiful day. My car broke down. I had to be towed from Fishguard to Knowlton. The infrastructure is not brilliant. So the first part of a Welsh project would have to be what's going to make this cohere. I think there's a very interesting thing going to happen in the next 20 years. about Celtic Britain or the Celtic British Isles. If Scotland does go independent, there's a way of looking at the map, and I've seen it done, where you tilt the map and there's another country. It's Scotland, the Isle of Man, and Ireland, and it actually looks like it looks like New Zealand. If you take England off it, you slice it off with Photoshop, it's quite a big country. Now, we're talking about St. David earlier, and the whole, St. Patrick set off from White Sands Beach. It'd be very easy to imagine Wales being pulled, certainly West Wales economically. I don't know what's happened at Fishguard since Brexit, but you can see an economic vibrancy. I put my radio on in my caravan, I can hear Irish radio, so I can see. I wouldn't say that we're ever frozen in the relationship of nations to the British state, and of course beyond Scotland, beyond Wales. What's the problem? That if the Scots do go, I don't think the English will hold it together. I just don't think they'll have the emotional maturity to hold it together. And there's a big identity problem. A lot of people in my generation, I don't feel particularly English. I was telling you before that for slightly sectarian rugby union versus rugby league reasons, I'll often go to the Millennium Stadium and support Wales playing rugby union. They play better rugby union, the atmosphere is better. You don't get a load of racist, horrible rubbish in your ear from English people. Now, all our national identities are in this era of highly mobile and networked culture. I think always going to be morphing and changing. So yeah, I think that even people who've spent their entire life in one silo, whether it's the Welsh language or Plaid or Welsh Labour, we're part of the union. I think everybody's got to be open to a different future, because Scotland will blow the constitutional settlement. And I've written about this in the New Statesman this week. For those of you who are lucky enough to have a subscription and can read it, I think it'll also be a big thing for the monarchy. If Scotland decides to have the Queen or Prince Charles, if he's the one who's the monarch, as their monarch, but they set different constitutional terms, that'll be a very interesting thing for us in England and Wales to say, well, maybe we should take part in that discussion as well. Maybe we should have demands on the Queen or the King for a new relationship to Parliament. So it's a long answer, but I'm fascinated by it, and I bet a lot of people in the audience are as well.
Paul, that's absolutely great. Thank you very much. Can I suggest that you have a look at the sidebar, and maybe you read out some of the questions that you take fancy to, and give your responses to them? Yeah, for a few minutes now.
I'm not going to answer this question about social care destroying families, because I don't have enough expertise on it. I'm sorry. Somebody's pointed out that the conversation we're having is relevant to This Week in Wales Wellbeing Economy Alliance, but I don't know what that is. It sounds good though. A lot of people somebody's asked, what's my opinion of the Great Reset presented by the World Economic Forum? Now, I'm lucky enough to be one of the people who've actually been to Davos. It was almost the worst week of my life. It's snowy, you have to walk everywhere, but if you're a mere pleb, like a sort of quite famous national journalist who works for Newsnight, you just get shunted into a side road and you can't even get a taxi. It's the worst place in the world for 2 weeks, because it's just full of rich people. It's full of making corrupt deals. Now, however, they've realized that this can't go on. And so Klaus Schwab, who runs Davos, said, right, we're going to do a blueprint for what capitalism should look like if it's going to survive. And he did. And it's all things like sustainability, circularity, which means reusing everything. Obviously, it's green. Obviously, it's gender equality. Everything's there. What happened? A symptom of our time. What I expected to happen was that people will go, all right, we'll do this. It sounds good, but then they don't do it. That would be the kind of Cameron Blair era response. But no, this wasn't good enough. The Trump era response is to mobilize conspiracy theorists to say the whole thing is a plan by the elite to take over the world and destroy us. So now the WEF, this poor, pathetic capitalist club, has become like enemy number one for the capitalist right. They're mobilizing their conspiracy theorists, and of course, it all gets mixed in with anti-Semitism and the Rothschilds theory and the rest of it, QAnon. So, yeah, I think the program itself of the Great Reset is having influence in business. Another big thing that's having influence in business is the investment firm BlackRock, the biggest in the world, saying, guys, unless you stop investing in carbon, you're going to lose your money. So there is I like dialogues with progressive capitalists, but it's so funny to see, Fox News, the Murdoch empire, Trump, and all the little trolls on Facebook and Twitter going crazy about the WEF. The moment capitalism makes one step towards more equality. Let me look at another question. Somebody says they want to see your views. I mean, yeah, feel free to join in. The use of disinformation against devolution has been very active. First Minister announced changes to restrictions. The threat of these elements undermining our democracy is real. How does Wales combat this against a media that is largely centred outside of Wales? Well, interesting, isn't it? First of all, that's not part of my lived experience. I haven't been there long. I was there. I spent about 2 months in Wales during the summer last year and didn't see what you're talking about, but let's assume it's there. Not just talking about independence here, because which is still a minority for independence, but talking about devolution. So you've got the political right in Wales on that, basically trying to roll back devolution. I do think it has to sell itself better. I think COVID's been a good opportunity. But let's think about something. What successful nationalisms do is that are progressive is that they become cosmopolitan. When I was in Barcelona on the day of their unofficial referendum, 1st of October 2018, what was brilliant was to see that they had this rally just before where they were trying to embody on a stage what is Catalan nationalism. Why do we want this 17 million people to leave Spain? And they had their national costume, their dress, their language, their music. They do this dance. They make strange castles of human beings. It's quite an amazing culture, as you know. On the stage comes two Syrians in Syrian national costumes. And what was the symbolism of that? They're refugees. The symbolism is our nationalism is cosmopolitan. Our nationalism can absorb anybody. And if you know about the history of Wales, as I'm sure you do, you will know that the valleys absorb people from Italy, from Spain, from all over the mining regions of the world. I think that the answer to the disinformation is to make the devolutionism or the nationalism, whichever you want it to be, more resilient to the modern world. Now, I don't know how you do that. I think having an arts council and a cultural economy that is very, distinct and progressive and refuses to back down in the face of being bullied by Westminster and, funds thing. I can't remember the name of the show, but there was an amazing reenactment of a migrant boat arrival on the Gower a couple of years ago that we went to. It was quite a stunning piece of art done in Wales, done in a Welsh setting, having a global significance. Of course, it's the same place, by the way, now where they've banged up all the recent migrants, isn't it? And the fascists are going down picketing the army camp. There's downside. I just wanted to make a plea for a cosmopolitan nationalism or a cosmopolitan separatism, if that is what people want. Oh, there's other stuff. Yeah, Adam Curtis. It'll take me a whole night to talk about Adam Curtis. Is there going to be another banking crisis because of COVID? Well, look, no. But the reason is because we've borrowed 17% of GDP in a year. I'm an economics correspondent, and I remember, people saying 3% of GDP deficit is too high. 17%. The debt, which is like your accumulated overdrafts, the debt is 100% of GDP, and it will go higher. As long as governments are prepared to bail out businesses and pay people to do nothing, banks won't be going bust. But the payback comes when, and I think this will happen in the mid-21st century, major countries try to dump the costs of the debt onto each other. There'll be some kind of international debt reneging crisis, like there was in the 1920s and 1930s, where the debt was mainly war reparations that the Germans started to refuse to pay. I believe we'll end up somewhere like that. But we now have ways that central banks and states can bail out banks. Most banks are implicitly already pre-bailed out by the state itself. It's not great for savers. Savers won't get any return on their investment at the moment, getting 0% or thereabouts. But that's the price of having a fairly stable banking system in a very unstable world. Do you want to say anything, Martin? Because there's a lot of these questions that I could come back to, but any of in your head?
Well, I mean, going back to the issue about the, devolution versus independence question, and the way in which Johnson is clearly, and this is becoming more and more clear actually as time goes on, he is very intent on rolling back devolution.
Yeah.
And he's so dishonest, isn't he? Because what he tries to say is, he actually will say that he's giving the Senate more powers when he's actually taking them away. So I think the likelihood is, and I've written about this in the Western Mail, is that in the next term, there's going to be quite a serious constitutional crisis that arises. Clearly, so far as people in England are concerned, most of the focus will be on Scotland. But in Wales, people like Mark Drakeford have been making the sort of comments that a few years ago they wouldn't have made at all. I mean, Mark Drakeford was an ultimate unionist, and he's now expressing doubts about the survivability of the union. Jeremy Miles, who's the Counsel General, who's quite a moderate kind of Labour guy. I mean, he was involved with Progress, for example, but I mean he. I think through his personal involvement in discussions with UK government ministers, has become very disillusioned with the way in which these people are operating, and he just can see the way in which they're desperately trying to roll back devolution, which they never really agreed with in the first place, and they're doing their damnedest to try to push it back. And I think this is going to be a very serious issue. And of course, as you know, in the Senate election, there is this group of people who are calling themselves Abolish the Welsh Assembly Party, and they're going to be making a lot of noise. Neil Hamilton is trying to desperately save his seat. He's moved over to South Wales East, where he originally comes from, and he's fighting on a similar sort of ticket. So there is going to be this sort of cultural war around. And I mean, the strong likelihood is that Labour, well, I'm certain that Labour will continue to be the largest party, but I do think that they're likely to have to do some sort of deal with Plaid. In order to retain a majority after the election, and then it'll be very interesting to see what the terms of such an agreement are. And I think Plaid would be very foolish just to sort of, say we're just going to sort of, throw our toys out of the pram and just walk away and just leave Labour to get on with a minority administration. They need to forge a proper agreement to move things forward because of the very kind of challenges that neoliberalism is posing in Wales.
Absolutely.
And so absolutely. I agree with.
I would just say the choice for Welsh voters is: do you want a strong progressive government or a weak progressive government? And I think that you also think about it. There's parts of the Tory party that have already checked out of the Scotland motel. They know that they're going to lose it. Maybe not this decade, but next decade. They're already thinking, what would an England, Wales, because of course Northern Ireland is, already not part of our marketing goods. I mean, so that's if Margaret Thatcher's power was to, Margaret Thatcher's ultimate thing was to hand Zimbabwe to a black Marxist party, ZANU-PF. Boris Johnson will basically handed Northern Ireland to a future united Ireland, and he's alienated the Scots to the point where, even despite Salmon v Sturgeon, the SNP are still soaring in the polls, even if independence is taking a dent. Now, there is one obstacle to independence, Scottish independence, and I think people should take it very seriously, and that is the scale of the debt. The whole of the Scottish independence thing was based on the idea that there was going to be an equitable partition where Scotland emerges as an independent country with no debt, but pays off its old debts to Britain over a few decades. Now, there was no sign that anybody would have agreed to that. But now, think about it. That was when the debt was 70% of GDP. Now it's 100% of GDP. So the Brits, the English, will have them over a barrel, whichever way they go. They either forgive their debts and then they subject them to Bank of England scrutiny. So they have to impose austerity, become unpopular, people clamoring to reopen the Union, or they just abandon Scotland and let it go independent, and it will immediately have to impose austerity because the European Union will demand it does so as a precondition. So don't think that the independence route, once you start looking at it, is actually very difficult. And if it was difficult for Scotland with 6 million people and an oil industry and a relatively backbone of communications down the middle of it, it's going to be difficult for Wales. I'm not saying it's impossible, but there are a price to pay. However, I think you're right. There's going to be a constitutional crisis, and everybody's going to have to think about these things. And I think that it just points me more and more towards the idea that we have big differences on the progressive side of politics. I respect people who've been in the Greens all their life. They were right to say, there's no socialism on a dead planet. This is the priority. They were right. As a left Labour person, I have my views about the right wing of Labour, but they're secondary compared to Boris Johnson. And with Plaid, we're part of the same. I would say we're all part. We want a roughly similar outcome, which is green and socially just and equitable and racially just. The Tories don't want that. They don't want that. They're the party of the hedge funds, but increasingly the party of. Now I'm 61, so I'm not dissing elderly people, but they're increasingly part of the party of elderly xenophobic people who would happily abolish the Senate without even ever having visited Wales. Somebody said to them, should the Senate be abolished? Yeah, abolish it. I don't like it. Full of Welsh people. That's the attitude. I'm sorry, the attitude I'm finding in the towns, the English towns I've campaigned in. Of course, this is not just an English thing. You'll find it in Wales as well. Is that people fantasizing about ethnic cleansing? There's some very reactionary people out there. The Tories are the party of them. So the end of the answer is we've got to find ways of forming political alliances to achieve progress in our lifetime.
Paul, I'm under strict instructions from the organisers that we've got to call it a day by 8:30. We're now at 8:28. So, look, it's been really enjoyable talking to you. I found the book very inspirational, a hell of a lot of ideas in it, which will spark off all sorts of directions for people who read it. So I would thoroughly recommend the book, and I'm very much looking.
Can I just apologise because I didn't see that there were two tabs. I was looking in the chat and I wasn't looking in the Q&A. I'm sorry, there's some excellent questions in. I will certainly come and talk about Aristotle in St. David's. I would certainly come and communities are important, and I would have talked about that. I'm so sorry. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just take a screenshot of that, and next time I'll make sure I do talk about it. But thank you for having me. And like so many people have said, when you come here in person, let's have a pint. The pub will be full, but we probably should. I would certainly love to come and do this talk in person somewhere in Pembrokeshire if you'll invite me.
Tremendous. Thanks very much indeed, Paul. And thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Great.
Cheers.
Thank you. Patrick, thank you for that.
Thank you so much. That was just absolutely brilliant. Really, really grateful. So
Good, and we had about 60 or 70 people as well. That's good.
Yeah, no, we had good numbers, really good numbers, and lots of great people. We also had another 15 or so on the Facebook link as well.
Okay.
So
Super.
yeah, no, that was fantastic. So when are you coming down to Knowlton? That's what I want to know.
Soon as they let us in, I'll be there. I'll stay all summer as soon as Drakeford opens the border, because we can't come just because the border's open, just because Wales is reopening. We're not allowed to come. So
no, I'm aware of that. No, I'm aware of that. Well, as you can probably hear, I'm not a native of this land, but I've lived here for 16 years now, so absolutely love it. Yeah. And but yeah, so when you come, I think I've got your phone. So yes, I've got your phone.
Yeah. Look.
So I will text you my details. Stay in touch, and when you're down, get in touch, and we'll get Ivor and I, who's the other main organizer living in Solva.
Yeah, let's do that.
We'll get together, but we definitely want to do this again, either later this year or early next year.
Well, let's do it then. When my new book comes out and there's something to talk about, it'd be worth.
Yeah. When are you going to publish that?
It looks like it could be August now. It was meant to come out in May, but the COVID. What's the problem is there's even things like paper shortages because of COVID. There's it's all the production schedules of publishers have been put back. Like Finnish sawmills, paper mills are not working to capacity. So that now anyway, but that
pushes it back. Yeah,
be about August, I think now.
Well, I'm very excited to read it. I must say.
Good. Well, look, you do text me your details and I will. Thank you for.
We'll get you around for dinner or a drink or whatever.
Be great.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you, Paul. You really got a fabulous start. I really appreciate it.
See you then. Take care.
All the best.
Bye bye.
Bye, everyone.